Well, hello everyone and welcome. You are tuned into the Cosmic Connection, and this week our theme is What Goes Around Comes Around. My name is Amanda Pua Walsh. I'm the founder of Astrology Hub, and I am here with the Merlin, Rick Levine. Welcome everyone. We're so happy that you're here. And Rick, why do you say that? Why is the theme What Goes Around Comes Around?
It's because we couldn't think of anything else. No, it's because this is a theme that this is what drives astrology. This is a theme that we could have this discussion at any time. I mean, pretty much at any time, period. But it seems particularly important right now because we are at a time in history when things are coming around. But I don't mean only from a long scale historical view. I'm also talking about in a much closer scale, like over the last year or so. And even, just in our personal lives, one could say, translating what goes around comes around into Sanskrit would be karma. Because it's Newton's third law, which is basically every action has an opposite and equal reaction. It's a law of physics. And yet when I say what goes around comes around, it's really even more than karma. Or I mean, it's not limited to the idea that every action has a reaction, because the planets are always moving around. And the planets move around in similar resonances, meaning that Mercury goes around the sun once every 88 days, like clockwork. Venus goes around the sun once every 224 and a half days, like clockwork. And the Earth goes around the sun once every 365 and a quarter days, and so on. And so basically, things that are going around come back to where they were. And yet every time something comes back to where it was, everything else is slightly different. And that's the magic of why astrology and the universe is not mechanical, because the condition is never the same. We're never in the same place. It's the old saying is you can't step into the same river twice because the water is different. And so what goes around comes around is particularly interesting now, I think in particular on a couple of levels. The first thing is that if we looked at the chart of the United States of America, when the United States during the Revolutionary War, Pluto was in the sign of Capricorn, and Pluto takes about 243, 44 years to go around once. And so what that means is that while 243 times the sun has gone around and come around, and in that same period of time, Saturn has gone around and come around maybe 9 times because it's about maybe 8.5 times because it's about 30 years a cycle. In that same time, Pluto is just coming around to the first time. And when planets come around to where they were, it's karmic. It always reopens the same portal, even though everything else is different, that was open when it was in that spot, however many years ago at the previous time, that it was there. And so I think what's significant here is on a very, very grand scale, we have the fact that Pluto is coming around. In fact, on July 4th, 1776, Pluto was at 27 degrees of Capricorn, 27 degrees of Capricorn. Right now, Pluto's at 23, almost 24 degrees of Capricorn, but it nudged up close to that 27 and now it's retrograde. And on top of that, Saturn, which moved into Aquarius, has moved back into Capricorn. Saturn's at 29 and a half degrees of Capricorn, but that Saturn is in fact heading back to that same position where Pluto was. And so we have these energies that are basically coalescing around the point where Pluto was, if you think of it, planets are in charts of a country when they are born, just like when they are in a human's chart. And so the fact that the United States is a Cancer, I mean, think of Homeland and think of how we celebrate July 4th, with Homeland and family and food and laying like a crab with our belly up at the beach. I mean, that in fact that's the United States. And although we have Sagittarian influences in the United States' chart and an Aquarian influence that kind of bring us out, all of that stuff that we go outward as a country is really all about protectionism. It's about the insecurity that we have of not being in charge or in control and wanting to basically dominate, which Cancers often do. Cancer signs, I mean, I don't mean just a Cancer sun sign, but the energy of Cancer often has to do with a manipulation so that there was an element of control. And you think of the overpowering mother. I mean, that's, as someone who had a Jewish mother, I know what that is. And, and in her expression of love, she was, unbeknownst to her at times, very overpowering. And so this idea of things coming round, we just celebrated the United States' birthday. But the point is that we have this Pluto return that's dredging stuff up and kind of creating, I mean, Pluto, remember, is like the cosmic roto-rooter. Pluto's job is to go in and go through the pipes that are filled with shit and to basically clear them so the energy can flow. That's Pluto's job. I mean, yes, it's death and regeneration, but even that, it basically clears the decks so that whether it's reincarnation or freedom into some other plane of existence or whatever, that Pluto's job is basically to bring down the current, but not in a nihilistic sense of just wanting to destroy the old. Pluto's job is to basically break the old structures so that new ones can form. Think of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Pluto's job is not killing the caterpillar. It's reconstructing the caterpillar so it can be a butterfly. And so we have that going on, and what goes around comes around. That's what's part of what's going on in the United States right now. And of course, when things change, people polarize. And we're certainly experiencing that because there's people who feel like they're on the wrong side of the proverbial stick. And I use that term guardedly because it has an image of dominance and submission, or an image of, let's say, master and slave even. And so being on the wrong end of the stick, one is more interested in having change. And yet being the stick holder, one might logically see that, but one might not necessarily be quite invested in giving up the power of being the dominant. And I think that that's largely one of the undertones of what's going on now, as what goes around comes around.
So this isn't just specific to the United States, though, right? Or are you saying the United States has it particularly emphasized because of Pluto return?
I'm saying with respect to that Pluto, it is the United States. France is next because their revolution occurred just a few years after the American Revolution. And so we're in this period of time where the first great democracies are having to face their shadows. And yet there are larger issues that are basically involving the entire world in this, but that's not what I was talking about here. What I was talking about here is this, in this first example, because a lot of what's happening right now I mean, even if we were talking about COVID offline just a few minutes ago, and you very correctly noted that one of the reasons why there's an explosion in cases in the United States is because we're doing more testing than we've done before, although we still may not be doing nearly as much testing as other countries. But here's the thing, is that if you just look at mortalities, the United States mortalities are crazy. I mean, they're like they're an order of magnitude higher than the other countries. And so there's something else going on. I mean, and I'm not talking about that just being this week. There's something about how the United States' position is feeding and or is fueling something that's going on globally. And it goes beyond COVID. It goes into the role of the United States in the entire world. And maybe it really touches on just the issue of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism. All of these things are in play, regardless of where you are in on the planet right now. I mean, certainly, Hong Kong, is having its, scenario. And I just picked that out just because it was for years for a century. I mean, it was one of the high points or significant points on the planet when it came to capitalism. So, these are times of great change. When times of great change happen, some people want that change to happen. Some people are working hard to make it happen. Other people are kind of caught in the middle. And then there are people who don't want change at all. It's like being in personal therapy. Yes, I'm in therapy for myself because I know I need to change. But I'm not going to change that. Because that's too important to me. Well, that's the thing that's got to go, and so it feels like on some level, the planet, but the United States largely being maybe one of the loudest, maybe the loudest voice on the planet, we're leading this kind of parade of like making it look like that what we're doing is holding the flag of the world and saying this is where we're going, when something obviously isn't working. Otherwise, things wouldn't be falling apart as they are. It's like what goes around comes around.
Rick, do you think, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm just really curious.
That's never stopped us before.
Never, ever. Do you think that the founding fathers chose the date?
I don't know. I've read stuff on both sides of that. I believe sometimes significant dates like that choose us. I honestly don't know if anyone said, let's wait until next Tuesday to do this. Just read a fascinating, I've been reading more history in the last, few weeks than I've read in a long time. And I am, as you know, a history buff. But I read this amazing piece that was from a book written by this Reconstructionist historian who basically was describing the lives and the social lives and the eating and drinking habits of our founding fathers. And in the late 18th century, there was one thing that basically no one drank. I mean, and you know what that was? Water. Because water killed you. Because water had disease in it. Water carried typhus and it carried cholera, and people did their best. I don't even think there was a concept then of pasteurization. I don't think that happened for another 50, 75 years maybe until the 19th century. And so there was no sense of water purification. People just knew when you drank water, it killed you. What'd they drink? Beer. Alcohol. Yeah. I mean, maybe not as strong as we sometimes drink it for entertainment value, but certainly maybe. But the fact of the matter is that they drank alcohol from the moment they got up in the morning until night. That was their liquid. And where did these people, where the Declaration of Independence largely was formed, the political lives then were in taverns. These stories of the taverns in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin, the great compromiser, he would basically conduct politics, from a restaurant table, most likely with brew.
They must have been so dehydrated.
Well, they probably drank a lot. But the point here is that I honestly believe from everything that I've read, and if someone out there has read other things, I certainly would be interested in it. But my sense is that these guys were in a state of heightened excitement and fear. I mean, you know, we forget the fact that they were British subjects and they were plotting to overthrow the government of the most powerful nation on earth, you know, and they were not doing it lightly. They felt they were driven to it. And of course, anyone who's down on conspiracies must be down on the United States, because the United States was founded by a bunch of conspiracist terrorists, period. I mean, I'm not judging. I'm just saying those are the facts. You know, to conspire means to breathe together. Con, Greek, with, and spire, aspiration, you know, to perspire, to, you know, respiration. And conspiracy is basically an act of people breathing as one. And so I honestly don't believe that at that time they were under such intensity of trying to figure out what to do, because no one wanted a revolution at first. What they wanted was the right to basically, you know, have votes in the British government so that they weren't taxed without being represented by the taxing body. That was what the Boston Tea Party was about. It was not about trying to be independent. And it wasn't until this guy, Thomas Paine, wrote a piece that was hand printed and distributed called Common Sense, which basically said, you know, we shouldn't stop at just getting, you know, our tax rights. They're obviously not going to give that to us. You know, we need to overthrow the government. And that's basically when it got exciting and frightening, because these were people going up against the most powerful nation in the world at that time. So I don't think that anyone said, should we wait until Tuesday? That's my sense. My sense is that the Declaration of Independence was written with this sense of high idealism that we know wasn't necessarily representative of the people who wrote it. I saw recently a piece with two seven generations removed, I think, grandchildren of Thomas Jefferson. One of them black through the Sally Hemings side, and one of them white through his marriage side. And these cousins, a black man and a white man, basically are what's the right word? They're working toward promoting the idea of taking down the Jefferson Monument in Washington. Why? Not because they think their great grandfather wasn't a great man. They think he was a great man with flaws, and that you can see the greatness and the flaws by going to his home at Monticello, where the slave part in all of this, and that he owned 150 or more people, and yet he went back into this tavern, got a little drunk, and said everyone's created free. And so there's a bit of shadow to the idealism of the document that fueled the country to go to war against the country that owned it. And in some way, and this might be a little bit of heresy, that going to war against England actually, like the Civil War, was in fact a civil war. We weren't fighting against another country because we were part of that country then. It was basically a war to throw off, the country that we were part of and create a new republic. So bringing that back to now, I find it totally fascinating that if this period of time goes down in history as the Second American Revolution, again, a revolution doesn't have to be violent, although there often is some aspects of violence when major cultures and power structures clash. But if this does go down in history, regardless of where the chips may fall, and I certainly don't know what that will be, I may be an astrologer, but I don't know the outcome of this for sure. And but regardless of which way it goes, the fact of the matter is that just like at our Saturn returns, we have a kind of coming to Jesus moment. We have a moment where if we're paying attention to our lives, as we approach our 29th, 30th birthday, we begin to look back and go, well, what's worked? What didn't work? Where am I now? How did I get here? Where do I want to go? How am I going to get there? And I think that's what the United States is going through right now. It goes around, comes around.
Would you agree? First of all, I just needed to say something about the word conspire and how it is so similar to the word ohana in Hawaiian. And it's amazing because ohana is a group of people who comes together and breathes or family. But it's amazing that conspire is actually just a very similar meaning. Okay. But do you agree or disagree? I've heard some astrologers say that the age of Pisces, it was a time in which we put our authority outside of ourselves and kind of put different kinds of people on pedestals and they were telling us what to do and we were taking direction from them. And then the age of Aquarius is more about inner authority. And because what you just said about the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and taking that down, taking the monument down, is almost like, okay, we put this human on a pedestal. We put this human up here as like a god.
That's
And
exactly what they were
and
saying.
what we're saying is he's not an awful human, but he's a human and he had flaws. So let's like take him down from the pedestal and look at the real situation. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing this as an age of Pisces, age of Aquarius kind of differentiation.
That's a really good question for a number of reasons. First of all, what Thomas Jefferson's descendants were saying was exactly that. That when you have this monument there, you turn this very human person who had amazing vision, but was a flawed product of his times. You turn him into a god, and we would rather know that this country was founded by very real people rather than like in Rome, where every emperor, when you were conquered by Rome, you basically had to have two things in your country. If the Roman Empire conquered you, you were okay to practice your own religion as long as it was written in a book. If it was codified, you could practice your own religion, and you had to accept the emperor of Rome as a god.
Whoa.
That was it. If you could do
Wow.
both of those things, they left you alone and you were fine. But I mean, crazy things. But I think that's exactly right. Now, whether this is a function of the age of Pisces or not is tricky because there's no one around who can convince me when the age of Aquarius either began or will begin.
Right.
There are many people who hold the position that the age of Aquarius, that we were on the cusp of the age of Aquarius around the time of the American and French revolutions, because those were the first times when, instead of being ruled by a god, a king, remember, kings, royalty was divinely gifted. The king was a representative of the divine. And so with the French Revolution, post Napoleon, who was divine unto himself, so to speak. But with the French Revolution, and then with the American Revolution throwing off or attempting to throw off the shackles of King George at that time, a lot of people say that was the beginning of the common man coming into power. So whether that was the beginning of the age of Aquarius, or as some people say, if the life and death and resurrection of Jesus was the beginning of the age of Aquarius, well, an age is about 2,170 some odd years, which means that the age of Aquarius won't begin for another century and a half at least. Regardless, we're talking about a 2000.
You mean the birth of Christ as the beginning of the age of Pisces?
That's what I meant. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
No, thank you so much. There are many people who say that Jesus was in fact the avatar of the age of Pisces, which a good case can be made for that. But the age of Pisces was not just about giving up authority. It's more complicated than that, because what it really has to do with the symbol of the two fish swimming in opposite directions, it represents the two opposite forces in nature. Again, whatever polarity you want to use, yin, yang, up, down, in, out, male, female, good, evil, red state, blue state, vaxxer, anti-vaxxer. I don't care what polarities you use. But in Pisces, these two polarities are going in opposite directions, and yet they're linked by a line. The symbol of Pisces being the two curved lines with a line across it. It's the fish swimming in opposite directions, and it's connected by what's sometimes referred to as a golden thread, a mystical connection between life and death. And here's the thing, is that common man could never understand nor ever be allowed to understand how those two lines were connected, how the opposite forces, good and evil, were connected, how humanness and godliness, whatever the opposites are, that was reserved for the priesthood. So it wasn't about royalty, although royalty was divinely inspired also. The real meaning, I think, behind Pisces has to do with not being able to experience the divine individually. We have to go to a priest.
An intermediary.
That's right. The priest is like the corpus callosum that connects the right and left brain. The priest is based, which is why astrology was shunted aside, because if people went to see the astrologer, they were getting the information directly from the cosmos, and that would take the power away from the priests, who are the intermediary between the divine proportion, God, and life here on earth. Now, I do agree, though, that what we're seeing, regardless of when the age of Aquarius began, is beginning, or will begin, I think what we're seeing is I was going to say a deification, an undeification, I don't know what the right word is, but we're taking the gods and this and turning them into humans, in effect.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, this began on a philosophical and academic level 100 years ago, or slightly more than that, in the 19th century, with the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who declared God is dead. Now, it wasn't like just some statement, God is dead. The philosophy was that this concept that had been so in control was now being Plutonized. It was being deconstructed. Nihilism is basically that which is the most important at the top of the mountain, deconstructs and falls to the bottom, and then the new arises. Mm-hmm. And you see the whole, what's called, rather than God is dead, the academic term is radical theology. And radical theology has seen a brilliant history that grew through the 19th century, not only with Nietzsche, but Soren Kierkegaard and Martin Buber and all these brilliant existentialist-like thinkers who began to realize, that then culminated with Freud and Jung, that said that there is a relationship with God, but God is basically an internal, psychological, symbolic, archetypal thing that is everywhere, and you do not have to be tied to a religious covenant in order to have a relationship with God, even though you may not like that word, because that word implies Judaism or Christianity or Islamic or Buddhist thinking or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that what we use that word God is basically an archetype for that which is infused everywhere. And lo and behold, we come up with this archetypal psychology, quantum physics, that says the universe is intelligent. The universe has intelligence, whether or not we partake in it. Deal with that, and this is modern, theoretical physics. And so I do think that as we move into the age of Aquarius, and without getting too technical, the ages last about 2,100, 2,200 years, because it has to do with the wobble of the earth, and that wobble of the earth, what goes around comes around. Well, this goes around once every 26,000 years. And even in Hinduism, they had time cycles that were at that length, but in our limited perspective in the West, we don't measure time for more than a couple thousand years at a chunk. And in fact, when we say the year is 1931 or 2024, we're basically saying, whether it's accurate or not, it's the 2000, now it's the 2020th year into the age of Aquarius, even though it's not technically exact age. That's really where that measurement comes from, as if anything happened before then was on a different time scheme. And, the Hebrew calendar, we're in the 6,000, the years are approaching 6,000, and so time is a funny thing, but I do think that the changing of the ages is about a redistribution of not just who's in control and who's in power. But maybe more importantly, who gets to define reality? And actually, I was going to read a quote from this, and I'm not going to, but I want to share this book title with you because it was a book that was very important to me some 40 years ago or so. And this book is by a PhD. Actually, he's a medical doctor and a psychiatrist named R.D. Laing. And R.D. Laing wrote this and a few other books, and this book is called The Politics of Experience. And, basically, the book, it makes a case for many people who we call crazy, clinically crazy, schizophrenic, are actually people who are having religious conversion experiences. And that the politics of experience is basically owning the experience rather than falling into a label by those in control who are threatened by people experiencing God personally. Are you with me here?
Yes.
So this book is a fantastic book, and it's, in this already famous book, British psychiatrist attacks the establishment assumptions about normality with a radical and challenging view of mental sickness that is built into our society.
Rick, I see this happen with the children a lot. This box that they're meant to be in, and if they're not, they get labeled, they get, drugs, they get all kinds of things because they're not fitting into the box that they're supposed to. And
the box of normalcy.
Right, exactly. And it just, I can see a lot of that getting deconstructed at this time too. And so would you say, so we're talking about what goes around comes around. We've talked about Pluto and the United States. I'm sure there's other things that are making this conversation relevant right now. I mean, this whole year is a karmic year, correct?
Well, yeah, and let's actually say, aside from a birth chart, whether you're the United States or Amanda Pua Walsh, aside from a birth chart where planets can come back around to where they were, planets also come back around to where they were in relationship with each other. This is what a new moon is. A new moon doesn't matter when you are born. It doesn't matter what country you're in. A new moon is when the moon comes around and catches up with the sun again. And by that time, the sun is another 30 degrees forward. So we have a new moon once a month. And so this whole idea that what goes around comes around doesn't have to be pinned to a country. And what's going around and coming around now in a way that really hasn't in modern history is the fact that this 3 times a century lineup, like a new moon, of Saturn lining up with Pluto is being also lined up with Jupiter. Now, there's no one day when Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto are in an exact straight line. But from a cosmic perspective, we have these 3 heavyweights within, like right now, they're within 7 degrees of arc. If you were looking at a natal chart and saw 2 planets, let's say, the Sun and Venus, and they were like 6 or 7 degrees apart, you would say that they were conjunct. And so even though it's not exact, we've had since last year, since last year when Jupiter moved into Capricorn, we've had and then the Saturn-Pluto conjunction back in January. We've had this kind of shifting alignment between Saturn and Pluto and Saturn and Jupiter and Pluto, which we just last week had the second of 3 of, which is part of the spike of all the stuff that's going down now, these hidden psychological things from the depth, issues that we don't want to deal with, we don't want to look at, whether it's racism or power abuse or whatever it might be, these things are coming up into the open. Today, the Supreme Court ruled that the subpoenas on Trump's finances were legal. Now, regardless of what they show or don't show, regardless of how that plays out, all that's saying is that Jupiter is conjuncting Pluto, and the stuff that's been hidden is going to come up into the open. And so we have that going on that doesn't play through until the week of Election Day in the United States. Very significant, I think. But it's not really until Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto all turn direct, and Jupiter catches up with Pluto in mid-November, and then by the end of December, on solstice day, December 21st, Jupiter and Saturn both have moved into the next sign of Aquarius, and there they line up again. And so this period of time is a return, but it's not just a return of where the planets coming back to where they were, like a Pluto return or a Saturn return. It's a return of several, what's the right word? It's like a confluence of things coming together of a once every 30-year cycle of Saturn and Pluto, a once every 13-year cycle of Jupiter and Pluto, a once every 20-year cycle of Jupiter and Saturn. However, this Jupiter and Saturn conjunction is also part of a 4.5 century cycle that has to do with how they switch elements. I don't want to go there, but it's another layer deeper. And in fact, also this Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurs in Saturn's own sign, Capricorn, and the last time that occurred was 500 years ago. And so, yeah, what goes around comes around. I've been saying this for a while, but the era that we're going through right now is a lot like, but very different than, the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation was a protest against the power structure of that time. Now, unfortunately, a case could be made, if one is looking at this from the standpoint of European colonialism and the treatment of slaves in Africa in general. The Protestants didn't do a whole lot better than the Catholics. So I'm not making this into a goody-goody thing. Wasn't the Protestant Reformation wonderful? But it was a way, it was a step in throwing off this absolute control of Rome. And here we are again. Things that go around come around to where they were, and we're getting another opportunity to do it right. In the early 1500s, around that Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, 1518, I think, was the conjunction. This was the first flourishing of the Caribbean slave trade, I think mostly by the Portuguese at first. I may not be completely correct there, but that's what grew. That's what grew this country. That's what grew the whole new world. And so a combination of that and the Protestant Reformation, which saw other countries, aside from Germany or the Protestants or the Martin Luther Protestants, in Germany pulling away. It was then the English and the Scandinavians, and it was a cascading fragmentation so that the power of the church is still there. I mean, the Vatican is a shadow that still runs a whole lot more than we think it does. That's another rabbit hole that we do not need to go down right now.
Okay, so if we're talking about what goes around comes around and having another opportunity to do things right or different than we've done it before, it seems like one of the most important things to be asking ourselves is, where are we perpetuating the same consciousness that contributed to the problems that we don't want to see anymore in our world? So there's the issues, but then there's the consciousness behind how those issues get created. And so, and because one of the questions you brought up is who gets to define reality? Who gets to define reality? And each one of us sitting with, how are we contributing to the reality, and what kind of reality do we want to create, and who's defining my reality right now, etc.
Although I've never seen the program, because I'm not a TV watcher and I don't even watch movies much, I've read most everything Philip K. Dick wrote. And his book, The Man in the High Castle, which may or may not have a whole lot to do with the TV version of it, I've never seen it, basically addresses that question. It's what would it look like living in the United States if, in fact, the Japanese and the Germans won the war? What would life be? What would it be like living here now? Because the reality that we would live in would be defined by those who won. And so what happens is that we make the mistake of thinking that the reality that we live in is our history, when in fact our history is simply one thread which was written by those who won the wars continually. And when I say the wars, I don't only mean the physical wars, the metaphysical wars, the religious wars, the scientific wars, because the things that are dominant then basically become the reality tunnel, and everything else gets shunted aside, and that's not what's true. And so, yeah, what we have now, and you said something else that I think is incredibly important, because, God, I wish I could reconstruct exactly what you said. It's something like we are being asked to look at
The consciousness level that
created. Okay,
that
yeah,
created the situation that we're all, wanting to redefine or create anew,
all right.
essentially.
I agree with you, and the but is in my academic psychology days, I read a book that was required reading for would-be therapists, called A Theory of Personality by a man named George Kelly, medical doctor, psychiatrist. Maybe he was a psychologist, but in his book, he talked about how everyone has a worldview, a worldview. We all have a way in which we construct the world. The worldview of someone who grew up in the white suburbs in the United States is very different than the worldview of someone who grew up in poverty on an island that had no electricity in Indonesia, for example. Worldviews are basically how we see our place in the universe. We alter our worldviews often by experiences that we have and what we're taught. The problem is that, well, what George Kelly said was that the therapist's job was to help a client, a patient, understand their worldview, and then help them alter their worldview so that their new worldview gave them choices that they didn't know they had because they were not part of the old worldview.
Right.
If your worldview is that everyone is blue, then you meet someone green, they're not a person because it's not part of your worldview. You have a view of the world, and you know that green people are not part of your world or part of the world. And so what you said raises the problem that many people have such ingrained world views that what you said would be alien to them because they wouldn't know, they wouldn't have the breadth of vision to even know that they should go back and look at what it is that we've assumed and where the history of these thoughts and ideas came from, because this is real. This is all there is. That's all I know. Boom, this is the way it is. And therefore, anything that threatens that's going to be wrong. And therefore, I'm going to go out and buy a white robe, and I'm going to, basically eradicate this threat to what I know is the truth and reality. And so I think that, and it's much deeper than just the racist, image that I just used. This infuses everywhere. And that's why I've been on this bandstand, soapbox, I guess it's not a bandstand, whatever, mountaintop, basically preaching that we all have to look at the things we know to be false. We all have to look at those things which are most threatening to our worldview. Doesn't mean we need to agree with them or embrace them or even say that now I'm going to believe this, not that. But it's the inability that we have to see the multiplicity that gets us into a situation where we have such extremism that two people who actually probably have common goals can hate each other so thoroughly because they can't say anything without the other person disagreeing with them to the extent of wanting to hurt them for even thinking that. That's the situation we're in.
I totally hear what you're saying about some people not even being able to see that they're just a complete product of their worldview, and not even having the thought to question that, or the desire to question that. I tend to think that this audience that we have, these are the kind of people who would ask those kinds of questions and be open.
I do too, but we're back to the person in therapy who says, I want to be liberated. I want to be enlightened. I want to heal my life. I want to have happy relationships. I want to be a good parent. I want to be blah, 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 blah. And then they get into therapy and shit comes up, and they basically, not consciously, and this is not an excuse, This is a mechanism that Freud discovered, and Jung and other psychodynamic psychologists basically, took the ball and ran with it. But we bring up resistance to anything that could possibly threaten the ego. And the ego is not a bad thing. The ego is what pays our rent and keeps us alive and makes us eat right. The ego is how we navigate our body and keep ourselves alive, as we move through life. And so this whole thing of like, get rid of your ego, fine, do that, but then you'll stop eating and won't have a place to sleep and you'll die. And that's one good way of getting rid of an ego. But the point here is that it's tricky territory, because there's a lot of us, and I know that I've been in this bandwagon, soapboxes, whatever, man. I've been here before in my life, and I don't think there's a way in which we can gauge how deeply we are there or not, because it's easy to give lip service. It's easy to say, yes, I'm so down with this. This is great. But when it comes right down to it, I'm going to spend my last $100, on a video game rather than giving it to a cause that might save someone's life. So it's tricky territory, and yet there's lots of glimmers of hope that is just magnificent. I recently saw, I don't watch any TV, but I watch some clips occasionally on YouTube, especially if they come recommended. And I watched a short clip of Cornel West with Anderson Cooper. And it was very, very moving. And Cornel West's point was at the funeral for George Floyd that there was these, I don't know how many hundreds of people who came together. The whole thing was recorded, so broadcasted some. There was never anything expressed other than love and want for justice. There was no call to arms. There was no there was certainly anger, but there was no backlash of hostility. It was basically lifting the energy up to a place of a higher cause. And I know that there is a lot of damage being done now on all sides, but I think that there are people who are pushed up against the wall far enough, like we were as colonialists, as people in the United States. We were pushed up far enough against the wall that we got guns and started shooting the people whose country we were living in, so to speak, until we made it our own. I'm not justifying that. I'm simply saying that there's lots of hopeful things going on right now that lead one to believe that anything is possible. And anyone who predicts right now how it will come out, basically, if they're right, they'll say, I predicted it. And if they're wrong, they'll try to forget about it. But no one's going to predict what's happening because they know. They're predicting what's happening because A, they fear that will happen, or B, because they want that to happen. And that's where the danger comes in when we try to predict the future. We say we're doing it mechanically, but unconsciously or consciously, we have other issues going on. And yet there's a lot of hope and potential in this moment, mostly because I am firmly convinced that there is no one in charge. That the people who are normally in charge, whether they're good people or bad people, the people who are normally in charge, whether we agree with them or politically or don't agree with them politically, the people who are normally in charge, who are running the show, right now there's no one running the show. And that includes the government, the deep state, the wide state, the shadows, the conspiracists, the revolutionaries, the Illuminati. I don't care who it is. I mean, I'm agnostic when it comes to that kind of stuff. I think anything is possible. However, I absolutely believe that there's no one in charge. Now, on one hand, that is frightening. On the other hand, Mom and Dad's not home. We can do anything. No, I'm serious. And that is the hope of what's going on right now. It's the craziness of this moment. No one knows what's really going on. Again, even the people who know they know what's going on, and even the people who know that these other people know, no one knows what's going on. And
It's, I don't know if it was you or Anne or one of you that I was interviewing said that the institutions and the systems that we've relied on for so long, they're going through an even bigger transformation than we are individually. And so they're it's almost like they're like gutted from the inside out, and there's a shell or a veneer of power still, and yet there's complete chaos and turmoil within the system and structure itself.
we have
And
we have a dysfunctional Saturn. Saturn is the rules and the authority. And when it comes to that right now, dad is not home. And when dad is not home, what dad does is make stronger rules, yells louder. Basically, the insecure Saturn becomes the despot, becomes the dictator, becomes that person in control who's not really, you see, and I think we talked about this a bit last week, and that is as we move into the age of Aquarius, the ideal situation is not having a dissolution of the government. It's not having Borg, where we are all insect hive mind. It's having a government that's actually a reflection of the governed, which is really what the Declaration of Independence set out to state. But it was a double standard from the beginning. And what goes around comes around. We're now having to face that shadow. And as much as we're facing that shadow, as much as many people are facing that shadow, there's a lot of people who are saying there ain't no shadow. You're making all this up, and you're getting in the way of this great country, and you shall be eliminated, and your voices shall be silenced.
Whew, okay. Just some light Thursday evening conversation. All right. So some of the things that we've talked about today is this idea of karma, what goes around comes around, and this is happening at a collective level, but also paying attention to that in your life. It's like that, you reap what you sow. And
well, very much so. And to bring it right down to here, like right now this week, we have Mercury, which has been retrograde for the last couple of weeks, last 2.5 weeks. It turns direct this weekend, and it's just another example of this things going around and coming around. Mercury goes around the sun once every 88 days. From Earth's point of view, it looks like it goes forward, backward, forward, backward. And right now, Mercury has just it has recovered areas of the sky that it has already been over. And now as it turns direct on Sunday, and then over the next couple of weeks, it goes through that same area of sky for the third and final time. There's again even though Mercury is going direct and everyone goes, oh, how great, I'm so glad Mercury retrograded. What we're basically doing is we're having to eat the meals that we prepared, a month and a half ago, stirred up a couple of weeks ago, and now it's all we have to eat. We got to revisit. So again, what goes around comes around on a much tighter, closer level. We're coming into a new moon about a week and a half later. We can talk more about that next week. But between now and the new moon, not only does Mercury turn direct, but the sun moving through Cancer is opposite Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn in Capricorn, which again is stirring up all the stuff from over the last year or so. And again, as Mercury comes through there, it'll bring up that again. And the new moon, which is not an eclipse, but I'm saying that this may be more powerful than the previous 3 eclipses. Why? Because this new moon is exactly opposite Saturn, and Saturn is the lord of karma. What goes around comes around.
wow. I haven't heard anybody say that. That's incredible to hear. More powerful than the last 3 eclipses.
Look,
Everybody
okay.
breathe. Everybody breathe. It's okay.
Honesty in astrology. I just made that up. I'm not sure that I believe that absolutely, but I think that, I actually think that there's a sense of finality around this because this new moon occurs at the end of Cancer and the end of Capricorn, by the time that sun is around 6 months from now, back around in Capricorn, Jupiter and Saturn are going to be moved on into Aquarius. And so it's almost like last week we talked about how this was a time of remedial education, the 6 months with Saturn back in Capricorn. Well, it's almost like between now and the new moon on the 20th, it's almost like that's going to be our first pop quiz. It's like, how are you doing so far? Well, okay, here's the quiz. Everyone has to take it, and I think there'll be some reflection on where we're at.
Okay. One other thing that we've talked about today is this idea of putting people on pedestals as God, and where do we have a tendency to do that, and how can we bring that power back inside and recognize the humanness that all these leaders, all these everything.
Chiron just turning retrograde this week, and it turning retrograde, and Mars moving forward, and a Mars Chiron conjunction, which occurs on July 14th. That's next Tuesday. This is basically, remember, Chiron is the part of each and every one of us that, like the mythological Chiron, is wounded. If you're human, you have Chiron. If you're human, you have a wound. And although we each have wounds that we can heal with therapy, with psychedelic drugs, with yoga, with meditation, with dancing, with walking in nature, we have wounds we can heal. But we also have wounds that don't heal. And that's what Chiron had a critical wound that would not heal, but was granted immortality. Every one of us has that Chironic piece where we have the part of us that has a wound that hurts, that is wounded in one way or another, that creates that whole shadow side. And as that comes into the light, we can acknowledge it, but Chiron's wounds don't necessarily heal. What they do is we work with them, we become aware of them, we manage them, we put them into a place where they don't overwhelm and disrupt our lives. And I think to some extent, this Chiron retrograde in Aries with Mars in its own sign in Aries, I think the dethroning of gods, whether they ever personally intended to be a god or not, when you find yourself in a position of power and that power continues to grow and it seems like it's limitless in whatever limited sphere you may operate, it's hard to remember sometimes that you're a human. And I think that what we see going on right now in lots of nooks and crannies of the social world, of the governmental political world, is we see this idea of kind of like the emperor's new clothes, the story of the emperor who was convinced by his supporters that he should wear this amazing new suit and that only people, that he had to be special to be able to see it. And he wouldn't admit that he wasn't special. And of course, he went on to this parade, and this one 5-year-old girl in the story says, "Look, the emperor has no clothes." And then all of a sudden, everyone realized, and everyone, oh my, I'm not the only one who, and that story has, I think, particular relevance to Chiron turning retrograde into these times as we begin to see the emperors without clothes. Now, an emperor without clothes may be an absolute wonderful, beneficent leader, but not necessarily a god.
Mm-hmm. One of the words that came up for me when you were talking about Chiron and the wound and what to do with it is the Cancerian word of mother it and hold it, nurture it, instead of, trying to do that to it. Okay. The other thing we talked about is our own reality, considering who's defining it, that we're getting an opportunity to do things over again, to do them right this time. So in order to do that, again, I keep coming back to, we have to recognize where we're continuing to contribute to the same thing that we're fighting against.
We have to, which is difficult because we make it invisible. That's what the psyche does.
Right. Now, one of the ways that I have found is really helpful to do that is to ask a question. So when I'm in a situation with a person and I'm feeling the any negative emotions, any like frustration or anger or whatever. It's to take that moment to ask, what am I not seeing here? Like, what is there for me to see here that I'm not seeing? And it's amazing. I truly believe that a lot of the time, if not all the time, our questions define our reality. So if we can open up and ask
I
bigger
would,
questions,
I would say nearly always. I mean,
nearly always, exactly.
the
So
search determines reality.
yeah. So when we can ask different questions, what is real here? What is false here? What is ready to be redefined here? What is reality that I'm not seeing here? What is the reality with the capital R that I'm not seeing here? All these kinds of questions can open up the opportunity for new insights.
And
It's not
again,
going to come from trying to think about it.
no, but again, the problem is just the fact that you can do that. Just the fact that you do that probably puts you in a minority.
It's
Because
a practice thing for sure. There has to be a desire to do it, and then there has to be practice. I mean, it is something that can be practiced all day.
yes, but even before there's a desire to do it, there has to be a worldview that says that's a potential thing that one could do or not.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people don't even get there. They don't get to that. They just live their life the way that they live it. Done.
True.
And I think that hopefully that number is going down, and hopefully because of the intensity of the experiences of these times, hopefully more and more people are either having the time or the space or the reason to do some of that questioning. And again, it doesn't matter what your answer is. The questioning becomes the important process, and asking questions that you wouldn't normally ask.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. And then the time period between now and the new moon is kind of like this pop quiz period in our July remedial education. So I guess with that, just pay attention to what challenges you're facing, and maybe do what you can to approach it differently than you might have in the past.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is about, working toward deepening integrity, toward being open to other people's points of view. Remember, this is the sun and moon coming up to the new moon opposite all these Capricorn planets. There's my self-nurturing, my self-protection, and then there's the structures out there. Where do those two bump up against each other? And what have I assumed based upon what I've been taught? And how does that not necessarily match up with maybe something that I'm seeing or feeling or learning about now? And again, it's not that I need to just go out and say, well, now I'm going to be one of them and not one of these. It's just a matter of being able to create dialogue, because building those bridges, as we've talked about before, is really the thing that's going to get us through this.
There's an amazing talk, you guys, by it's Greg Braden, Nassim Haramein, and Bruce Lipton. And the interview or the series is, I think, Unity Now. Shoot, I got to get the name for it. But one of the things that they're talking about is, that unity is totally scientifically backed. It's not some like idea, but there's so much evidence and research and et cetera confirming that. And so all these ideas of us being different and polarized, it's actually not real.
Venus and Gemini, we're in love with the idea of being distracted by the diversity.
Exactly. And one of the things that Greg Braden said in that talk is the world is being distracted by divergence right now. That we're distracted by these seeming opposites, but there's so much coming up confirming that we're actually a lot more alike than we are different. And it's just a great talk if you all want to check it out.
Yeah,
I think it was Unity Now. It's a series. So
Yeah.
Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, and Nassim Haramein, three just great men.
Three of my favorite people.
Yeah, exactly. In one room on one talk. It's amazing. Zoom room, of course. Okay, so Rick, thank you. We have our homework. We have our remedial education, and we have a lot of work to do. This coming from a Capricorn who loved school. I'm one of those weird people who loved it.
I loved learning, but I did most of my best learning outside of the classroom.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, Rick, for being here. Check out Rick's Instagram page.
I was going to say, is this where you tell everyone about where my Instagram page is?
Yes. Rick Levine Astrologer.
Right.
You can, one of the things I wanted to mention to all of you is we have started an actual academy page within Astrology Hub. So it's where our course catalog is. We're going to continue growing it. We have our Astrology of Relationships course with Rick there, but you can sort the catalog by teacher, by level, by type of astrology. So right now the catalog, I don't know how many classes we have, like 10 to 12 or something. We have 90 like just waiting. And so we're bringing those out over time. But if you want to go check it out to see some of the courses that we do have available, I'd love to have you over there.
Well, that would be great. And I understand that not yet, but pretty soon there'll be an introductory course by Rick Levine in that group.
Yes, yes. And we will actually be having a wait list for that come up very soon. But this fall, we'll all be able to go back to school. Rick is going to be teaching an introduction to astrology course. So for those of you that love his approach, love his the way that he's practicing astrology, you're going to get real inside scoop on how it's all working. So that's coming in September. So stay tuned.
Okay.
All right. Have a great week, everybody.
I'd say can
And
I go home now, but I haven't left home for months.
all right, everybody, take care, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community. And thank you, as always, for making astrology a part of your life. I'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you, Amanda.